In the spring of 1462, the roads of Wallachia were quiet, too quiet. Fields that should have been bursting with crops lay blackened, their stalks nothing but ash scattered by the wind. Villages that once rang with laughter and the clang of blacksmiths' hammers were abandoned shells, their doors swinging loose, their roofs caved in. Even the rivers, lifelines of the land, were poisoned, dead fish floating silently downstream. This was no accident. This was strategy. At the center of this desolation was a man who ruled with equal parts brilliance and terror, Vlad the Impaler, voivode of Wallachia. To his people he was a protector, cruel, yes, but steadfast in defending their fragile corner of Europe. To his enemies he was Vlad Dracula, the son of the dragon, and to history he would be remembered by a name whispered with both fear and fascination, Vlad the Impaler. His enemy in that fateful year was none other than Mehmed II, the young but ruthless Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, the man who, just 9 years earlier, had done the impossible and taken Constantinople, turning the Eastern Roman capital into Istanbul. To the Christian kingdoms of Europe, Mehmed was a specter of unstoppable conquest. His armies had crushed every foe, and now his gaze had turned toward the small, defiant principality of Wallachia. But Vlad knew something the Sultan did not. He understood his land better than anyone. Every river crossing, every stretch of forest, every mountain pass. He knew the Ottomans would come expecting the usual, to march in, burn a few towns, crush resistance in the field, and install a puppet ruler. Vlad had no intention of giving them that kind of war. Instead, he prepared a strategy so ruthless, so complete, that it would become one of the most terrifying chapters of medieval history. He evacuated entire villages, moving his people deeper into the Carpathian forests or across the mountains into Transylvania. He ordered food stores burned, wells filled with filth, and bridges destroyed. Even the animals were taken or slaughtered to deny the invaders meat. When news of the approaching Ottoman army reached him, Vlad reportedly told his commanders, "They will find nothing but earth and ash, and they will learn that this land does not forgive." The plan was simple: turn Wallachia itself into a weapon, force Mehmed's army to march through an empty land where the only things waiting for them would be disease, starvation, and fear. By May, the trap was set. 90,000 Ottoman soldiers, an unstoppable force by any measure, crossed the Danube into Wallachia, expecting an easy conquest. What they found instead was a silence so deep it felt alive, and in that silence the legend of Vlad Dracula was about to be written in fire and blood. The first days of the invasion felt wrong. The Ottoman scouts rode ahead, expecting to find watchmen in towers, farmers tending fields, children running through dusty streets. Instead, every village was the same: doors unhinged, windows shattered, ashes still warm in the wind. No voices, no footsteps, only silence. As the army pressed deeper into Wallachia, the silence turned to dread. Granaries were reduced to blackened pits. Wells were filled with rotting carcasses or poisoned with ash and lime, leaving the water foul and undrinkable. Even the orchards had been chopped down, their fruit left to rot in the mud. The Byzantine historian Leonikos Chalkokondyles wrote of the shock that rippled through the ranks. Not a house was left to shelter them, not a beast to slaughter, not a drop of wine to drink. It was as if the earth itself had turned against the Sultan. It wasn't just starvation that crept into the soldiers' minds. It was fear. They didn't know the land. They didn't know its hidden paths or its traps. At night they heard the howls of wolves from the forests and the distant crackle of unseen fires. Vlad's own letter to Matthias Corvinus, king of Hungary, still survives. In it, Vlad explains his brutal but calculated strategy. "I have killed peasants, men and women, old and young. We have burned the villages, we have poisoned the wells. They will find nothing but death here." This was not cruelty for its own sake. Vlad knew that an army of 90,000 men needed an endless river of food, water, and rest to keep moving. Take that away, and the army collapses before a single arrow is loosed. And collapse, slowly, it did. By the second week, sickness spread through the Ottoman ranks. Men collapsed by the roadside with fever and dysentery. Horses starved and fell where they stood, their carcasses bloating under the summer sun. Desertions became common, groups of soldiers slipping into the forests, never to return. What terrified them most wasn't the hunger or the disease. It was the sense of being hunted. From the shadows of the dense Carpathian woods, Wallachian scouts watched their every move. At night, riders darted through the darkness, striking isolated patrols, killing silently, and vanishing before the Ottomans could organize a response. By June, Mehmed's army had begun to understand this was not a war of battles. It was a war of exhaustion, fought against an invisible enemy who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. And just when the fear began to settle deep into the bones of the soldiers, the Ottomans stumbled upon their first true nightmare, the forest of the dead. The first sign was the smell. Before the soldiers saw anything, the wind carried it to them, the stench of rot, thick and sour, curling into the back of their throats. Some covered their faces with cloth, others gagged silently as they marched. And then, over the next rise, the truth revealed itself. The horizon was filled with stakes, thousands of them. Each stake, sharpened to a brutal point, bore the lifeless body of a man, woman, or child. Some were still fresh, their skin pale and slack under the sun. Others had blackened with time, hollow eyes staring down at the soldiers as they passed. The scene stretched for miles, lining the roads that led deeper into Wallachia, a grotesque path carved straight through fear itself. This was no chaotic massacre. It was deliberate, calculated theater. At the heart of this nightmare stood the gates of Targovishte, Vlad's stronghold. There, arranged in what one Ottoman chronicler later called a forest of punishment, were over 20,000 impaled corpses, Ottoman soldiers, captured scouts, even envoys sent by the Sultan himself. The Venetian ambassador in Buda wrote of the moment. Even the bravest men, hardened by war, trembled and turned pale at the sight. It was as though hell had risen to the earth. Among the dead were high-ranking Ottoman envoys who had once stood before Vlad, refusing to remove their turbans out of religious custom. Vlad, in his cold and twisted logic, honored their choice. "Then let them keep their hats," he reportedly said, before ordering their turbans nailed to their skulls and their bodies raised high for all to see. The effect was devastating. Soldiers who had marched with pride and confidence only weeks earlier now averted their eyes, their hands shaking as they tightened their grips on their weapons. The bravest whispered prayers under their breath. The less brave vomited into the dirt. Even Mehmed II, conqueror of Constantinople and ruler of an empire, is said to have sat frozen on his horse, staring at the endless rows of bodies. Chroniclers claim the Sultan muttered a single word under his breath: Dracula. What the Sultan realized in that moment was simple but chilling. He was not facing a man fighting for survival. He was facing a ruler who had weaponized fear itself and would burn his own land to ash to see his enemy break. And break they did. The once mighty army, now starved and trembling, continued forward with the ghostly eyes of the dead, watching their every step. But Vlad wasn't done. Not yet. Fear is a strange thing. It doesn't strike like a sword. It creeps. It builds. It takes root in the mind, turning every shadow into an enemy, every sound into a warning. And Vlad Tepes, Vlad Dracula, understood this better than anyone. Impalement wasn't new in the 15th century. The Ottomans used it. So did the Hungarians and the Byzantines before them. But what Vlad did was different. He perfected fear, turned it from a punishment into a message. Every stake planted in the soil of Wallachia wasn't just death. It was a story that said, "If you come here, you will not leave alive." For his own people, this brutal theater served another purpose. Wallachia was small, vulnerable, and constantly under threat. Unity wasn't optional. It was survival. And Vlad made sure his subjects understood this with a kind of ruthless clarity. Villagers who broke orders during wartime? Staked. Nobles who plotted behind his back? Staked. Even entire communities that dared to support his rivals were left as grisly reminders that loyalty wasn't just expected, it was enforced. And so his people obeyed, not out of love, not even out of respect, but out of the bone-deep knowledge that defying their prince meant a slow, agonizing death on the edge of a sharpened pole. For the Ottomans, though, the message was far more terrifying. To them, Vlad wasn't a man. He was a phantom, a shadow that moved faster than their scouts could track. He didn't fight like they fought. He didn't meet them on open ground. Instead, he bled them, a raid here, an ambush there. And every strike was followed by the same image, bodies on stakes, staring down at the invaders like silent witnesses. By midsummer, panic ran deep through the Ottoman ranks. Patrols refused to ride at night. Soldiers whispered that Dracula could move through the forests without sound, that he drank the blood of the men he killed, that his soul had been traded for some unholy power. The stories didn't need to be true. Fear had already made them real. Chroniclers of the time spoke of Ottoman warriors, hardened men who had fought in Anatolia, the Balkans, and even the walls of Constantinople, breaking down in tears when they found another line of stakes, another warning carved into the land. Vlad had achieved what few commanders ever could. He turned an empire's strength into its weakness. Every soldier in Mehmed's army wasn't just fighting a war. They were fighting their own minds. And then, just when fear was at its sharpest, when the Ottomans had begun to dread every rustle of the forest, Vlad struck again. This time, he didn't just want fear. He wanted chaos. By June of 1462, the Ottoman camp was a sprawling city of tents and chaos. Tens of thousands of soldiers, engineers, and servants filled the plains. Fires flickered in the distance, banners snapped in the summer wind, and the once confident voices of Mehmed's men were now subdued whispers. Fear had settled like a fog over the army. Vlad saw his moment. He knew he couldn't meet an army of 90,000 in open combat, but he didn't need to. Instead, he planned something far more devastating, a night attack designed to tear through the Ottoman ranks like a storm. He gathered his best men, a few thousand riders who knew the terrain better than they knew their own homes. These were men hardened by years of raids, men who could move through the forests like ghosts and vanish before an enemy even knew they were there. Scouts mapped every corner of the Ottoman camp. They marked the command tents, They studied guard rotations, and they learned where the Sultan's personal pavilion stood, guarded but not untouchable. The goal was terrifyingly simple: kill Mehmed II. On the night of June 17th, the moon hid behind thick clouds, plunging the plains into near-total darkness. Vlad and his men moved silently, their horses' hooves wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound. The air was thick, humid, charged with the tension of what was to come. Then, with a single signal, all hell broke loose. Flaming arrows tore through the black sky, raining down on the Ottoman camp. Tents caught fire, one after another, flames leaping high as smoke billowed upward like a beacon of war. Wallachian riders thundered into the camp, screaming their war cries, cutting down anyone in their path. The Ottoman soldiers woke in chaos, blinded by smoke, choking on ash, slashing wildly at shadows that disappeared before their blades could land. Some tried to rally, others fled, but it didn't matter. Vlad's men had turned the camp into a maze of terror, striking fast and vanishing into the night before the enemy could respond. Contemporary accounts describe the carnage in vivid detail. Ottoman chroniclers admitted that thousands were killed, their bodies left trampled in the mud. Horses bolted in terror, wagons overturned, and supplies burned to ash. One report claims that Vlad himself cut his way to within a few hundred feet of the Sultan's tent. Guards fell in moments, their screams drowned out by the clash of steel and the roar of fire. Some historians argue that Mehmed barely escaped with his life, carried off by his elite guards as chaos consumed the camp. When dawn broke, the battlefield was unrecognizable. Bodies lay everywhere. Smoke still curled from the blackened ground. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers were dead, and the survivors, exhausted, terrified, and humiliated, looked to their commander with fear in their eyes. Mehmed had survived, but the message was clear: nowhere was safe. Vlad Dracula had struck the heart of the Ottoman army and vanished into the forests before they could even draw a breath, and in that moment the legend of the Impaler was sealed. By the summer of 1462, Mehmed's grand invasion, an army of nearly 90,000 men, the pride of the Ottoman Empire, was coming apart at the seams. The night attack had done more than kill soldiers. It had shattered morale. Every survivor carried the same look in their eyes: exhaustion, fear, and the creeping realization that Wallachia was not a place they could conquer. Disease stalked their ranks. Dysentery spread through the camps as the poisoned wells and rotting water took their toll. Starvation ate away at men and horses alike. Every day another scout failed to return. Every night another patrol vanished, their bodies later found, impaled on stakes by the roadside, left as warnings to the living. The forests themselves seemed alive, hostile. Soldiers whispered about Dracula moving like a phantom, striking from the shadows, killing without mercy, then vanishing before anyone could even raise a weapon. By late June, Mehmed had no choice but to retreat. The march back toward the Danube was chaos. Wagons were abandoned in the mud. Horses collapsed under the heat and hunger, their carcasses left for the carrion birds that circled constantly overhead. Some soldiers, too weak to keep up, were left behind, easy prey for Wallachian riders who descended like wolves on the stragglers. Chroniclers describe the retreat in chilling detail. The road to the Danube was littered with the dead, men, animals, the remains of the camp, all left to rot in the sun, the smell carried for miles. By the time the Ottomans finally crossed the river, their mighty invasion force had been reduced to a broken remnant of what it had been just months before. The empire that had conquered Constantinople, that had brought kingdoms to their knees, had been humbled, not by an army of equal strength, but by a man who knew how to turn fear, terrain, and time into weapons sharper than any sword. For Vlad, it was a triumph. Against impossible odds, he had defended his land and bled the greatest power in the region. But victory came at a terrible cost. Wallachia was a wasteland. Entire villages were gone, crops destroyed, and thousands of his own people had been displaced or killed. It was a Pyrrhic victory, one that left the land broken even as it cemented his reputation as the ruler who had defied an empire. And beyond the Carpathians, in the courts of Europe, the story of Vlad Dracula began to spread, sometimes as a tale of heroism, more often as a whispered horror. The seeds of a legend had been planted, and soon they would take root far beyond the mountains of Wallachia. When the dust settled and the Ottomans limped back across the Danube, Wallachia was silent. Its fields were blackened, its villages hollowed out, and its people exhausted. But the man at the center of it all, Vlad the Third Dracula, had done the impossible. He had stood his ground against the most powerful empire of the age. In his homeland, that made him a hero. To the peasants of Wallachia, Vlad was not a monster, but a savior, a ruler who, though merciless, had risked everything to keep foreign boots off their soil. Parents told their children stories of their voivode's cunning, of how he burned his own lands to starve the enemy, of how he turned forests into graveyards to frighten the invaders away. They feared him, yes, but it was the fear you feel for a storm, uncontrollable, devastating, but also protective. But beyond his borders, the narrative twisted into something far darker. The merchants of Transylvania and the Saxon settlers of the region had long despised Vlad. They had clashed with him over trade, over taxes, and over his ruthless punishment of anyone he saw as disloyal. And now they had a story to tell, a story that sold. By the late 1400s, pamphlets and broadsheets began circulating through the German states, filled with lurid tales of Dracula's cruelty. They spoke of mass impalements, thousands at a time, of banquets held among forests of the dead, of rivers running red with blood. Some claimed he mutilated his enemies before execution. Others accused him of dining beneath the still twitching bodies of his victims, laughing as their screams echoed through the night. Whether these tales were exaggerated propaganda or kernels of truth stretched beyond recognition hardly mattered. They spread like wildfire across Europe, painting a portrait of a man less human than demon. And then there was the name Dracula. To Vlad, Dracula simply meant son of the dragon, a nod to his father, a knight of the Order of the Dragon, sworn to defend Europe against Ottoman expansion. But in the West, the meaning twisted. Dracul, dragon, blurred into Drac, devil. Dracula became not just the son of the dragon, but the son of the devil. This duality, hero at home, monster abroad, kept his story alive. Over the centuries, his legend grew, carried by travelers' accounts, church records, and whispered tales in European taverns. By the 19th century, when Irish author Bram Stoker discovered the name Dracula, myth and history fused. The cunning voivode of Wallachia became something darker, an immortal predator, eternal and terrifying. Vlad's life ended as violently as it had been lived. In 1476, after years of betrayal and shifting alliances, he faced his enemies one last time. Somewhere in the forests that had been his shield, Vlad was ambushed and killed. Some say Ottoman swords cut him down, others whisper it was betrayal by his own boyars. What we know is that when the battle ended, the Prince of Wallachia lay dead, his legend just beginning. His head, preserved in honey, was sent to Mehmed II in Constantinople and displayed at the city gates, proof that the terror of Wallachia had finally fallen. But death didn't silence him. In Wallachia, he was remembered as a protector, a man who fought the greatest empire of his time and never knelt. Mothers spoke his name to their children as both a prayer and a warning. In Western Europe, the darker version thrived. Each retelling made him more monstrous, a shadow ruling through fear and blood. By 1897, Stoker's Dracula immortalized him, blending fact and fiction into the vampire legend that still stalks literature and cinema today. 5 centuries later, his shadow lingers. Tourists explore his ruins. Historians debate fact versus myth, and the name Dracula still commands awe and fear. Vlad Tepes's true legacy isn't just the bloodshed, it's the lesson carved into history. Fear, wielded with precision, can outlast any empire. Battles end, kings and sultans fade, but legends never die.